Hey, hi all. So I'm back again with the another interview questions of covering the Spring Boot interview questions. Basically, top 15 questions I have covered in this session, which are being most asked by the most of the companies of the interviewer. So let's get started. So these are the top 15 questions which I'll be covering as a part of this session. That firstly, the interviewer will be asking like what is Spring Boot application annotation. Then we have the second question. This is the basic question that what is the difference between both Spring Boot and Spring. Then we have the third question, these annotations like at the rate auto configuration, at the rate component scan, at the rate configuration, what it does. Basically we need to explain all three. And then at the rate qualifier versus at the rate primary, what are the differences. This is the fourth question. And for the fifth question they asked like what is dependency injection and what are its types of dependency injection. Then sixth question we have the difference between constructor dependency injection, setter dependency injection. Then seventh question they can ask like can we have two database connection in Spring Boot? If yes, then how? Like they ask. Then at eighth question we are having like how we can remove the embedded Tomcat server which is being added by the default from the Spring Boot side. How we can remove it? Then we have the connection pooling. Ninth question. This is like what is the connection pooling. Then we have 10th question, difference between SOAP and REST. Then we have the difference like web server and application server they can ask like and we have the different HTTP methods. So they can ask like can we use post HTTP request method instead of the put request? If so, so what are its consequences and what are its benefits they can ask. Then difference between controller and the REST controller they ask. Difference between path variable and the request parameter, the example they ask. And the last question they may ask or explain all types of bean scopes. So I have covered these some basic questions as a part of this interview series. Let's get started. If you haven't liked and subscribed my channel, please like, share, and subscribe my channel. So first question comes like what is at the rate Spring Boot application annotation. So basically it says that it is a meta annotation and it is a combination of three annotations. As I told earlier also in my Spring Boot series, if you have watched it, what is Spring Boot. So at the rate configuration, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate component scan. So basically at the rate configuration is used for the source of bean definitions. At the rate enable auto configuration, its main advantage that it auto configures all the dependencies defined in the class path, like in the pom.xml and everything you have added all the dependencies and then you are annotating or using the annotations. So Spring will download all the necessary jars from the central memory repository and it auto configures automatically. So that is the main advantage of at enable auto configuration. Then we have at component scan. Basically it scan for components like packages which we have want to scan, that this package will have in the application all the details. So we can use at component scan and services in the current package. And this Spring Boot application is a combination of these three annotations. So that's why we use a single annotation at the Spring Boot application instead of using these three one by one. And Spring Boot is used so that it is marks the main class of a Spring Boot application. In the main method we use this so that compiler will aware that this is the main application entry point, basically we can say. Then we have the next question, that is Spring Boot versus Spring. It's a most asked again easy question. Why we are using? Because in Spring Boot we have the auto configuration feature as I told. Then we have the embedded web servers we have. Then we have starter dependencies to create a standalone application. And if you go with Spring, so Spring requires manual setup and you need to configure all the configuration files and everything from manually from your side. But Spring Boot is convention over configuration. Means using Spring Boot, developer needs to mainly focus on the code and rather than maintaining all these configuration files and each and everything which we were doing earlier in Spring, so that we do not need to do in Spring Boot. So that is a main advantage. And Spring is a framework, and inside this framework only we have the Spring Boot framework, which is having a lot of advantage. So that's why nowadays most of the companies which are using microservices architecture, so they are going with the Spring Boot. Then we have at the rate auto configuration, at the rate component scan. At that configuration they can ask individually like what their purpose. So as I told earlier also, that at that configuration is used for defining the bean. It provides the bean definition, and inside that we at that bean we can provide and we can define all the beans. Then at that component scan is basically which scans all the packages and which scans for the classes which is having at that component, at that service, at that repository, and at that controller. And at that enable auto configuration, what it does, that it automatically configures all the beans depend on the class part dependencies. So these are the three annotations which are being most asked or the interview question. Okay. Now the next question is at the rate qualifier versus at the rate primary. So at the rate primary it's used when we allow for the exception and we are shown then this bean is needs to be used. Let me give you an example. Like for example, human is an interface and it is having suppose two beans, like a class is implementing that interface and it is trying to create two beans of the same type. Then we can have the ambiguity error faced by the compiler, like for which bean object needs to be created. So to resolve that, we use at the rate qualifier. Basically, it helps in defining that particular which bean we need to use. But sometimes, if we are sure like which particular bean we need to use, then we go for at the rate primary. So basically, at that qualifier we used when we need to resolve the ambiguity, but we are unsure like which v bean we need to use. So then we use at that qualifier. But if we are sure that this particular v bean we will be using it, and this is the primary bean, and at that primary its difference is that it's allow for the exceptions also. If we are sometimes it can throw the exception which we are not being thrown by the at that qualifier. So then we go with the added primary when we are sure for that this bean will be used, and added qualifier we use when we are unsure that this particular bean we need to use to resolve the ambiguity. Both are having the same purpose, just have a minute difference between both those two. Then we have the dependency injection is being asked. Like dependency injection, it is a design pattern that allow objects to be injected rather than created manually. It is having two types of dependency injection, or three types you can say: constructor based dependency injection, setter based dependency injection, and field level injection. And it is managed by the Spring IOC container. IOC container is like IOC stands for inversion of control. It having that it create the object, it manages the object's life cycle basically you can say. And in IOC only we have the dependency injection concept, where we inject each and every object into some other class like which we wanted, using auto add and component. So that is a dependency injection. It is a design pattern and it promotes loose coupling. Then we have the constructor versus setter dependency injection. So constructor is a dependency injection used by the constructor you can say, and it when we have the mandatory dependency, then we go for the constructor dependency injection. And constructor dependency injection is preferred for immutable fields you can say. And when you have the mandatory dependency, and setter dependency injection is used using the setter methods dependencies, and can be optional also. Where the dependencies are optional, then we go for setter dependency injection. How we connect two database connection in Spring Boot? This is another interview question being asked. Like we are having one database connection, you are going in the application properties, you have defined all the properties, but now you need to connect one more database. How you can connect it? So there is a concept that you can use either beans, you can define bean 1, bean 2, and then you can use it according to requirement, or you can go with that address primary or address qualifier you can use and configure each data source in application.properties or YML, and define separate entity manager and transaction manager if needed. Factory basically for establishing the connection, you define entity manager factory, right? So that you can define it, and for each one like, and then you can use it. And so this is another interview question which has been most asked, and most of the candidates is stuck here. Okay, then how we can remove the Tomcat from the Spring Boot server? By exclusion, or by excluding that particular dependency, we can remove it, and we can add our jetty or undertow alternative server which we wanted. This is the question being asked. Then connection pooling is there, that we can have for connection pooling. What it says that every time you don't need to have the connection with the database, a pool will be connected, and for particular timeout and everything will be configured via application.properties file, and max pool size you can define it. And then every time you don't need to interact with the DB or to generate the session in each, like in a single connection pooling only, you can you do not need to like basically connect database every time. So that's why we use the connection pooling, and Spring Boot uses Hikari CP by default. So this is another interview question being most asked, like every time having a new connection, you can go with the connection pooling concept. Then We have the SOAP versus React, and SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol, and REST stands for Representation State Transfer Protocol. SOAP is strict and is secure, and REST is flexible, lightweight, and scalable. That's it from my side. Yeah, thanks.